Well, hello everybody. My name's Marnie and I'd like to welcome you to Frankston City Library's FrankTALK tonight with Keith Banks. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which Frankston City Libraries operates, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement to the elders of any other communities who may be joining us today. Now, Keith Banks is one of Queensland's most decorated police officers, a recipient of the Bravery Medal and twice being awarded the prestigious Queensland Police Valour Medal, among many other honours. He was a member of the Queensland Police Force for 2 decades between 1975 and 1995, the most notoriously corrupt period in Queensland's history. Keith is passionate about supporting first responders dealing with PTSD, which stems from his personal experience with the condition. In writing Drugs, Guns and Lies, he strives to encourage a more open and authentic conversation around mental health and the reality of police work. Keith, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Marnie. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Well, Keith, what made you decide to write your story, and what was it like capturing it in Drugs, Guns and Lies and actually getting it on paper?
Yeah, great question. I often ask myself. I struggled with what I now understand to be PTSD for years. I left the police force in 1995, not for any other reason than I had just been emotionally broken, and it was time I left. I started writing probably 5 years ago, and I did it simply because I wanted to give something to my 2 daughters to help them understand some of the things that I'd been through, to give them maybe some sense of what had caused, the short-term anger and the guy that I was when they were growing up. I was never physically abusive, never. But certainly, I had what I now know to be symptoms of chronic PTSD. Drank way too much. Got morose and sad and had no joy and had just, I'd be antagonized by little things, just crazy stuff that, crazy, quite appropriate really. But when I went through my recovery or started recovering from that, I wanted to just sit down and write things. And I didn't write chronologically. I just wrote as things came back to me. And as I kept sort of going on the journey, I may go back and write the chapter about the academy. Then I may have gone forward 5 years and written something else. We actually downsized from a large house to a townhouse about 5 years ago. About that time, I was probably experimenting with writing. And one of the things I unpacked was a cardboard box that contained all my Undercover notebooks. So I actually started reading through them and went, wow, and it just was amazing how much reading through those notebooks brought things back. So then I just started really writing it. And I ran into a guy, of all places, at a pub, as you do, who was teaching at Flinders Uni in Adelaide. And he and I were part of a group of people, just had a chat over a few beers. I was telling some stories to my friends, as I want to do. And someone made that immortal comment, you should write a book. And I said, yeah, I'm starting stuff and I'm doing whatever. And then it transpired he was teaching creative writing. So he became my ghostwriter, but I call him my co-author. So what Ben did was he helped me understand the process of writing, I guess, and how to expand on my writing so it wasn't just like a police report. So that was an incredible journey, and I was able to put something in order. It was an incredibly cathartic thing for me because I was able to come to terms with some of the emotions that these memories brought up and look at them, I guess, through the lens of a more mature person, although my wife would probably argue about that. But look at it, I guess, with the benefit of hindsight. But also, really, I wanted to write a raw story. I wanted to get something out there so that people would read it and understand that policing is not about writing traffic tickets, not about, I don't know, standing on pedestrian crossings like I did in the first week of my service. But and I don't want to demean police work at all. There's a need to write traffic tickets, but policing is a lot more than that, and the impact it has on human beings who see things that thank God the majority of people never do. Yeah, they either see people at their worst, or they see them as victims, and there tends not to be any area in between. So so that was the purpose of writing, and I really enjoyed the process, and it was kind of sad when I finished it. I think it's Truman Capote maybe who used the quote that finishing a book is like taking a favorite child in the garden and shooting it.
A bit extreme.
Typical Truman Capote, but
Mhm.
but I kind of understand that now. Yeah.
Absolutely. And once it was down on paper and your wife Jennifer and your daughters Carly and Julia actually got to read it,
Yeah.
do you think it helped them understand when you were that, I guess, a little bit emotionally removed at times?
Yeah, it's been great, actually. Yeah, it's been it was the catalyst to have some quite challenging conversations, I suppose, from my behalf. I'd apologised to all of them some years ago when I realised that my behaviour was a result of PTSD. Having said that, though, I've only been officially diagnosed with it in the last 12 or 14 months. And that was simply a matter of finding the right site to talk through, who's been fantastic. But there are some things in there that I haven't spoken about to any of them, and it's quite confronting actually when your daughters are reading something about you did when you were a 21-year-old kid. The funny comment was my youngest actually said, "Gee, Dad, I understand this, but you talk about women a lot." I said, I was 21 and it was the 80s. What do you expect?
Exactly.
So no, so it's been good. It's been valuable. Thank you.
Absolutely. Though when I was reading it, all I could think of was that process you would have been going through while writing it. And I guess hopefully looking at what you had to do as an undercover police officer, looking at that with kindness and compassion and knowing you were doing it for the greater good.
Yeah, it was. That's a great question, Marnie. It was challenging because I know I've written. I can't remember the exact words, but it seemed to me like nothing had changed, and that the work that we had done really was like I think it was King Alfred or whoever trying to push back the tide. Um, and I actually had a call from Peter, who is in the book, who was my sort of first training undercover officer that I've written about. And he rang me and he said, "Listen, mate," he said, "I just want to say um, we did good. We did some good stuff." And he said, "Never forget that. We did make a change." And that was quite an emotional conversation to go through because it really, it probably affirmed for me that the penalty or the price that we all paid as young men actually was kind of worth it. And on reflection, yeah, we did do some good. It's just unfortunate that crime continues and drug dealing continues. But we did change
Absolutely.
lives. Yeah.
Absolutely. If you don't mind, I might just read a quick excerpt from your book
Sure.
that
Yeah.
really struck me out of the whole thing. And it really does, I guess, explain where you are now with your diagnosis as well, and how someone like yourself gets to there.
Yeah.
It's an accumulation of things, even from the days of mobiles, dead bodies, or attending dead bodies. You see things normal people never see in their lives, and they see it on TV and they think it's all clean. It's not. All that shit gradually accumulates. And I think when we talk about PTSD in this case, it's death by 1,000 cuts.
Mm.
And I know we were just chatting off air. Not many people would know. I don't talk about it that much on these talks. I talk about being in PR and journalism. But the 5 years before I moved over to council, I was in emergency response media with Vic Roads. So I was in the traffic management centre with the cameras on the road. And I was saying just before we came on air, the first time I realised I didn't bounce anymore. And I think it's really, really important to recognise those moments and make change at those moments. And I think throughout your book, you have many moments where you realise you're no longer getting the buzz, or it just doesn't fit right anymore. And you made the choice at that time to change areas.
Mm. Yep.
I don't know if I have a question about that, but but I just wanted to say that I just think it's so important for people to speak about that. And I know we were talking as well off air about the need to communicate, the need to talk about what's going on. and obviously back in the 70s and the 80s, that wasn't in place in the police force right around the country.
Oh God, no. Yeah, yeah.
You
It was.
know,
Yeah, it was a culture. It was a culture, Marnie, and I guess, and I've certainly reinforced this in the book as well. It was a culture of alcohol, and we didn't see a problem with it because that's what we were conditioned to. And I have written in there about the fact that I didn't drink before I volunteered for Undercover. Gee whiz, that changed within about 3 months. And I think the phrase is I went from a non-drinking, non-smoking fitness fanatic to a binge drinking, pot smoking undercover cop, and that was a matter of months. Yeah. But to cope with what we saw just as a normal course of duty, I suppose, and not every day was bad. There were some days where really nothing happened, but when things happened, they were quite severe. So we'd actually go to the pub or go to the police club and drink 20 beers, and we saw that as completely normal because you'd see some police that would go home to their partners and they'd take it out on them. No two ways about it, because that's an emotional, if you go to, I don't want to be too macabre, but a fatal road accident or suicide by train. A lot of people used to kill themselves by jumping in front of trains, and you see things that just don't leave you, and you need some way to unwind and get that over with or get it out. I think with modern policing, given the political correctness of the environment now, there are no bar fridges in police stations anymore. People aren't allowed to stay in the mess room and have a few beers and talk to their friends. As a consequence, I won't name where he works, but there's a friend of mine who's quite a senior policeman who said that the sick leave rate in this particular area with police is massive because they're just not able to decompress, I suppose. And I'm not suggesting the alcohol's the secret. It doesn't make your problems go away, it just makes them swim. But we didn't know that then. That was what we did. We drank a hell of a lot and self-medicated, and then went back to work the next day. So no one knew what PTSD was. No one really understood the symptoms of it until I think the late 80s from memory, maybe even later than that. And of course, then you combine that with the macho culture of policing where you don't want to show weakness because you might think that your mates, or you'd think that your mates might think that you're a bit lesser than you should be. So all of that combines to create the perfect storm. And it's only all these years later that when I've had my book published, I've actually had a number of people contact me who are either retired police or fireys or paramedics from that whole first responder situation and thank me for talking about it so openly because I'm hopefully helping demystify or destigmatize it. Yeah.
absolutely.
And it happens across all walks of life. You don't have to be in a gunfight or you don't have to see anything that's really horrible to have post-traumatic stress. You can be the victim of a crime. You can be, experiencing a lot of abuse through your life, whether it's from childhood or teenage years or whatever. And it's just really, it's a passion, as you can see, of mine. And I really want to get that conversation happening more and more.
Absolutely.
But anyway, book.
Yeah, I was going to say, I have a lot of friends in the police force, and I've seen some really struggle. I've seen some leave, and then, I know one that's moved over to fireys, and he couldn't believe the difference in the support that he was getting at the fireys that he didn't get at VicPol. I don't want to go too much into that, but I think it's something that while it's better, it could be so much better. And I think you're right about the stigma. There is definitely still a stigma around it. And while the support services are being made available, there's choice not to access them as a result of that stigma. And I think that's what needs to be broken down. And I think the work you're doing in having these conversations is only going to help that. I
hope so, because you are absolutely correct. Yeah, people won't access it because they're worried their career will be affected.
Absolutely. Now tell me, back to the book. Sure. I will share this one line though. There's probably 3 lines I want to share tonight. But this is the one after your first alcoholic beverage. So you've just done your first drug deal. You've had your first beer or 2.5-ish beers, and it's Les bounced out of his car and knocked on the front door. That's when I thought 2 things. One was how to put one foot in front of the other. The second was that an informant knew where an undercover lived.
That's exactly right.
That's the first. I actually had a giggle when I read that. I had these visions of you as an 18-year-old, just trying to put one foot in front of the other after having your first ever beer, trying to be professional.
Yep. That's exactly what it was like. I was, and look, people who've known me from the academy days just laugh hilariously at the fact that I was almost like I was almost preaching to everyone that you should never drink. It's no good for you. Don't do it. And and then suddenly, as I say, within 3 months of Undercover, I was drinking scotch and I was having tequilas at the end of the night and just, thinking, wow, how long's this been going on for?
Yeah. Why was I not a part of this?
But that first thing was, I thought you were going to read the line where I walked in and he said, we'll have 2 beers. And I said, I don't drink. And he looked at me and said, well, you do now.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Same incident. But I can't see a drug deal really going down with an orange juice in your hand somehow.
Yeah, this is true. This is true.
Yeah. Now tell me, what was it like to be an undercover cop? Like, just generally speaking, it was a life where you were sent away at the drop of a hat, sometimes with a partner, sometimes on your own. You'd almost have to make fake friends. What was that like, having to put your real life on hold?
Yeah, twofold really, because it's every undercover I've ever spoken to, in Australia at least, has pretty much said the same thing. And that is the most challenging part of an undercover life is that you set out on an operation knowing full well that the people you are befriending and working on, you will betray them. That's a very challenging thing as a human being to do, to know full well that you are creating these relationships with the intention of betraying someone. And particularly at that age, as I've said, I was 21, I was almost 22. And I'd be working on jobs where I actually quite liked the people. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them who were selling drugs, they were actually quite likable people. And, we'd laugh about the same things. We liked the same music. We'd hang out in pubs. And when we weren't talking business, it was pretty challenging to remember in the back of my mind, I was the good guy, they were the bad guys. Yeah. But unlike when I first joined the police force, bad guys don't necessarily have devil's horns. Yeah. They don't necessarily have that evil look about them. Some of them have, I've made the point somewhere, I think that my observation was that some of these people I was buying drugs from were actually faithful to their partners and they were family people. Wasn't the same of all police, so that's quite a confronting thing, as I say, to fake that friendship. What it did teach me was a couple of things, and that was that nothing is black and white. Yeah, it's all just shades of grey. And it also really taught me how to come out of my shell, So even now, when I left the police force, I travelled with corporate life for 20 years. Not uncommon for me to go out by myself to dinner or to a pub to have a beer and then end up with 6 friends because I was well over the whole shyness of saying no. As far as so undercover, you could never switch off. I used a name that was sort of familiar to me that wasn't my real name, and that was Jim, because my second name is James, and where I grew up in the country, because my uncle was Keith, my grandparents called me Jim or Jimmy. So in the back of my mind, if something had happened and someone said Jim, I'd sort of almost react to it anyway. But when you live that life, you cannot use your own name and you don't refer to yourself by your own name. You actually become the person that you are pretending to be within that line. Because you are pretending to be a drug dealer and a crim or a crook. Sometimes I was a gunman. Sometimes I was, a wimpy, naive kid. Sometimes I was a heroin dealer. And you need to live that life. And as my friend Larry famously said, being undercover is like being on NIDA or going through NIDA on steroids. Because if you have a bad review as an actor, you might be a bit upset by it. If a bad review as an undercover, you made it with a baseball bat around your head. So as far as my personal life was concerned, I didn't have relationships. I just couldn't do it because I couldn't tell people really what I was up to. Some police knew, of course, the ones in the drug squad, my circle of friends, But I was even so serious about it that I was training in Taekwondo, martial art, in those days. I know 4 or 5 times a week, and everyone I trained with knew that I was a uniformed cop. When I went undercover, I went in with a story that I'd been found with a bag of pot in my locker, and I'd been fired from the police force, and I was disgraced. That was really hard to do because I knew that these people were looking at me in a different light. So for that sort of 18 months or a bit more, I still kept training. And when I could, when I was in Brisbane, but I knew that they looked at me and went, oh, it was almost like you could see the disappointment in their eyes. And that's a tough thing to carry through with, yeah, but has to be done. The benefit of it was that as an undercover cop, we weren't bound by any rules. So I didn't have to report to duty every day at 8 o'clock or whatever. I could dress how I wanted to. I could wear an earring. I could, do what and as I've written about in the book, that became a little bit out of control for all of us because we had no direct supervisors. We had access to guns, marijuana, drank when we wanted to, lived a completely different life, and we started acting like crooks. And a couple of the guys, unfortunately, went over to the other side. So that was the challenge, was to maintain your moral compass. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's what I struggled with most in the book, is the thought that as an undercover police officer, yes, you're playing a role, but if you're then having to get stoned with a crook, that's your body. That you can't fake that. That impacts your life. And unfortunately for people like Harry, it did so much worse. And I think there are so many points in the book where it could have gone that way for you as well. Yeah. But you almost always had this mask on to remind yourself of the role you're playing. And I think early on in the book, one of your mentors in the beginning said, when you are stoned, you need to remember you're stoned. You need to remember you're high. You're not just enjoying it and doing whatever. You need to remember to not make any decisions because you're high. That's right. And still have that degree of control, I guess.
Yeah, which is hard to do, and particularly, and I guess when we were living that life, Marnie, none of us realised how dangerous it was. We just thought it was a huge adventure. And I look back now in those days and think, wow, I'd be sitting in a house with patched outlaw motorcycle gang guys, and there'd be shotguns on the floor, there'd be, guns or whatever. And I'd be sitting there thinking, this is all fantastic. Now, I look back and go, wow, we did stuff that was completely beyond the pale. Yeah. And Harry, who you speak about, that's one of the most tragic things I've ever seen. That was another major reason I really hoped I could get the book published, was to tell the story about him. And his heroin addiction was a direct result of his undercover work. It was just terrible. But he's actually turned his life around now. I tracked him down a few years ago, and he's clean. He's married. He worked in the health industry, as in a hospital, counselling junkies.
Oh wow, that's amazing, Keith. Yeah. Like I almost want to cry now. Like it's just because I know in your acknowledgements, the way you talk about Harry and the way you talk about him in the book, it could so easily have been anybody.
Yeah.
And when we think back to the story of you doing the deal with the speed and the sawed-off shotgun, and there's that moment, that was a moment for me that I went, that could have been a trigger point for you.
Yeah, true.
Having a drug you've never taken before and you don't know how you react to, A, could have been the end of you, or B, could have been the end of your lifestyle at that time and you're hooked, or B, the outcome you had.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's, when I was writing about that, because that was in my notebooks, etc. And it took me a while to write that, even though it's a fairly quick chapter, I think, from memory, because I actually literally sat here and thought, wow, that could have really gone badly. And so I'd write a paragraph or two, then I'd walk away, get a cup of tea, come back and go, whew, okay, right, yeah, just remember, this is what happened. Because, as I keep saying, I wanted it raw. There are too many books and TV shows and movies I've seen where the police are all heroic, and that's not the reality. Where the undercover guy has a van, an electrician's van with these people watching him and looking out for his welfare. No, we spent months away by ourselves. And back in the day before mobile phones, the only way to contact the office was a pocket full of 20-cent pieces and a public phone booth.
Yeah.
And in all honesty, there wasn't a great deal of care and concern by a lot of detectives about undercovers. We were a means to an end for them. We were a means for them to bolster their arrest records, and there wasn't a great deal of welfare. So again, it was a story that I wanted to be told, or that needed to be told to help people understand about policing, but also to pay homage to those brave kids that I worked with.
Absolutely.
Not all of them made it to this age, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And one that there's a part of me that wants to touch on this, but doesn't at the same time, but I will. And that was the use of drugs by children. And that's not your doing. That is the environment you were within. And, children lying about their age and having other people shoot up for them, like on their behalf.
Yeah.
At the age of 14.
Yeah. Tragic.
That's just, as the mother of an almost 6-year-old, that killed me. Absolutely killed me. But
that was hard to write about as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why I think you being able to put pen to paper on this one, I can only imagine what you've had to go through in rewriting it and reliving it, but also processing it at the same time.
Yeah, it's funny what the mind remembers, and I remember that with absolute clarity. He was just such a good little guy, and I actually thought he was older than 14 as well. It doesn't excuse what was done to him, and as I've written about, he and I shared, we shared some stuff. He was pretty violently treated by his father, and the trouble is, that's the paradox of Undercover. You know that you want to do something to help, but you can't. Because my cover was a heroin dealer. Why would I care?
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I do hope that in writing this, it has brought you some closure along the way.
It has. It has. I, to be brutally honest, probably before I started writing about this, I wouldn't have been able to talk about it without being a bit of a crying, jagging mess, So it's been very cathartic that way, and really bearing my soul about this to the public is probably the scariest thing I've ever done. But it's really, I just think it's incredibly beneficial to hopefully open some eyes.
Absolutely. And I think ultimately having all these conversations, it may be one of the most important things you do.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I hope there's some sort of ripple effect of conversations and discussions I'm having in the public arena.
Absolutely. Now tell me, the corruption that was happening in the Queensland police force when you were there, it absolutely astounded me. And to know that you were on cases or ended up in situations where senior officials were named on tape, but having that foresight to know that you needed to hold on to that tape and only to find out your files go missing. It was a very short, she was shocked they weren't there, but I wasn't. And I was like, I'm not either. And there were times where you have to remember this is real. Like this is a memoir and this is a biography, and it's not a story. What was it like having to work in that situation, not knowing who you could trust?
I use the analogy of water finds its own level. Yeah. So those of us who were straight found our other police who were straight and honest, and the vast majority of men and women that I've had the pleasure and the honor of working with and meeting, the vast majority were as honest as I was. The corruption in Queensland, however, was controlled by the Commissioner of Police. So in Victorian terms, they call it the Chief Commissioner, of course, but the Commissioner of Police, Lewis, and I can speak openly about him because he was convicted of these offences. He had, when you're in supreme control of an organisation, it's about you being able to control who goes where, who works with whom, and really change the narrative, which is exactly what he did with corruption. So he was part of what was called the Rat Pack back in the 60s, I think. There was Terry Lewis, someone called Tony Murphy, who I've mentioned in the book, and another one called Glenn Hallahan. They were the three bagmen for the police commissioner Bischoff, and they were literally they collected the money and they paid it to him, and he paid them their share. Lewis was later promoted to commissioner. There was a whole raft of, that's another story in itself, but we knew the boss was a crook, and we talk, when I say we, it'd be discussed on night shift when no one else was around, or you'd be in the car with your offsider and they'd say, "You do know the boss is a crook." "Yeah, I've heard that," etc. But it was sort of hushed tones, because the other thing to really emphasize is that you couldn't report anything to internal affairs, or as it was called, internal investigations, because we didn't know who you could trust in internal investigations. And in fact, when the Fitzgerald inquiry, our corruption inquiry, happened in the late 80s, a number of police inspectors who'd worked in internal investigations were charged with corruption. And I was given some great advice as a young detective when I'd finished Undercover and I came back to the CI branch, and I still wanted to change the world, and I came across something, and I said to my detective sergeant, "Okay, something's got to be done about this. I need to go to talk to internals." And he said, "My best advice, mate, is shut your mouth, because you talk to the wrong person, you'll come home, there'll either be," and it's almost word for word, "there'll either be a garage full of stolen TVs, or there'll be an ounce of heroin in your bedside table with someone waiting to execute a search warrant." And I went, wow. And it was just, but the corruption was really, I won't say confined, but certainly entrenched in small areas. The problem was those corrupt people had major influence. It's like, the Roger Rogerson that we've all heard of in Sydney. Rogerson was only a sergeant. He was a detective sergeant. He wasn't a boss, but he wielded an incredible amount of influence. And that's what happened in Queensland.
Absolutely. Now, you have achieved so much across your career. What do you think would be a highlight for you?
Look, it's still hard for me to say this, but being decorated. And it's funny, I used to read things about people who had medals for valor and think, wow, you'd be so proud of that. And I am. But it's also hard to talk about, because I still have it's almost like pushing your own wheelbarrow. It's running your own PR campaign. But I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud of the decorations, and it's not that they were for things that aren't in this book. But one in particular, I went to a situation with the intention of shooting and killing someone if I had to, and I ended up sitting with him and negotiating with him face to face for an hour and a half and saving his life. And that really turned my mindset around as well. So it was a benefit for both of us. I didn't kill him. He didn't kill me, because he had everything that he could have used. And yeah, I'm very proud of that. I saved the guy's life. Prior to that, I'd been involved in some shootings where people had died. So, that was a highlight for me. Lots of lowlights.
Well, I was actually going to say, rather than like a low light, but what would be one of the strangest things that's happened to you in your career?
Oh dear God. Geez, you talk to any cop, there's hundreds of them. Wow. Gee. Strangest. Well, I mean, I've been beaten up by police when I was undercover, but that wasn't strange. That was New South Wales corruption. But I think really running into, I'll go back to Undercover, but running into people that I'd gone to school with.
You do have an incident in the book.
Yeah. And I hadn't seen them, and I'm thinking, I've got a big beard, please don't recognize me. Hello, Keith. So that's when you have to really think on your feet, and and that happened. I hope there's a few others I hadn't mentioned in the book, but that had happened a lot. There's lots of funny stuff that happens when you're in the cops. Police have a black sense of humor. My God. And there are other stories about those things that I won't ruin for any particular future. That's a good question. I've got to think about that. Strangest thing. I'll get back to you at some point.
That's all right. So, as you said, you co-authored this book with Ben Smith.
Yeah.
What was it like having a co-author? I know you actually thank him for basically being patient with you and your intermittent writing.
Yeah.
What was that like, working with somebody else and being able to really, I guess, make your words flourish?
Yeah, it was. Well, the other challenge was it was remote because Ben lives in Adelaide. So we'd talk on weekends for hours, and he'd record the chats, and then he'd give me an idea of. He'd record the chats. I'd send over chapters that I'd written, and he'd come back and go, "Okay, maybe we need to change this characterization." And I'd go, "No. I don't want to create fiction. I want to actually have it as real as possible." So. And because Ben was from a creative writing background, and I was more, I want to tell it raw and uncensored, I guess. He did say with the first manuscript, he said, I think we use a fair bit of bad language, Keith. Maybe we don't need to use it as much. I went, yeah, okay, good point. But he helped me understand that it wasn't just about I said, he said. It was about creating scenes and environment. And another great thing he taught me was that less is more. So rather than go to great details to explain what I was thinking or other people were thinking, he just said, no, he said, leave that the reader will figure out the narrative. Yeah. So, and that was hugely beneficial to me. And we didn't agree on everything, and we didn't disagree on everything. He didn't really understand much about the world of policing prior to this. And now he's really changed his mindset. I think Ben was I wouldn't say anti-police, but he'd tolerate cops. But now he's a massive supporter because he's actually gone through my conversations and so on, and sort of had a glimpse into that world. And he was given a grant by the South Australian Arts Foundation or something, I think, and that enabled him to travel to Brisbane before lockdown in those halcyon days. So we went up there together, and I introduced him to some of my former colleagues, and made him sit in a pub for about 4 hours with them, and he listened to their stories and went, "Oh my God, what a different world!"
Yeah, these weren't fake that you're telling
me.
Yeah.
But it was really it was I think so. It was a really symbiotic relationship. He learned a lot from me, and that's now helping him in his writing because he's gone on to write some other things, or going on to write some other things, and it helped me understand that writing is much more than what I thought it was. So, which is so very cool.
Absolutely, what a great opportunity that you just happened to meet that night in the pub.
Serendipity, yeah.
Absolutely. Now, your publishing story. How did you go from meeting Ben and popping everything on paper to actually having a book?
Yeah. Well, I never thought it would happen. So when I'd finished, I actually wrote quite a larger manuscript, and I'm in a Facebook, an association that happens to have a Facebook page, an association called the Australian Bravery Association. So anyone who receives a medal for bravery or valor is asked to join the association, and it is not. I actually thought it might be just a bunch of people sitting around telling how brave they are. But it's actually the association supports people with PTSD, particularly civilians who've done some brave things and then had the consequences later. It supports families. It supports, it's a magnificent thing to be a part of. So I got onto the Facebook group and went, hey guys, because I'd been to some conferences, so I knew quite a lot of them. Hey guys, I finished a manuscript about my police journey and my struggle with PTSD. Any ideas what I should do with it, essentially? And a woman came back very quickly and said, yeah, look, I know a couple of publishers. Send me 2 chapters and a synopsis. And I went, okay. And I Googled what a synopsis was, and and just fired a couple of chapters off to her, and she sent them to Allen and Unwin and another publisher. And within a week, I had Richard Walsh from Allen and Unwin ring me and say, I want to talk to you. I want to read the rest. So he read the rest, and then we had a long discussion, and he persuaded me to stop the manuscript at a certain point in time, which is where the book ends. And so I rewrote the ending and so on. And I just thought, yeah, well, look, it'd be nice if it gets out there and sells a couple hundred, Wow.
That'd be nice. Yeah. That'd be nice. It just happens to be on our Read Now collection and on our digital collection and everything else. Now, I am curious. So you do mention that the publisher suggested it finished at a certain point in time. That left me hanging.
Good.
I felt like there were a couple of ties that were, tied up at the end, and talking about Larry and his paranoia, and that hopefully these people that you've come across over time are able to have the same feeling you do at that point.
Yep.
And then we hit the acknowledgements.
Mm.
I want to know what happens next. What, you're still in the police force in this, and you're not in the police force now.
That's
so
right.
What's next, Keith?
Well, I'm really happy that you have that need to know, Marnie, because that means the second one hopefully will get as much traction. I'm probably, I would think, 3/5 of the way through the second one. So I'd written, as I say, this larger manuscript, and I'd probably not really finished the second part as much as I would have. I'd just gotten to that. It was quite emotionally draining, quite a long journey, and I thought, yeah, you know what, that pretty much says it all for me, but not so. So I've been writing that now, for 3 months, I guess, and it's not a sequel. It's more a continuation, because
Part
that's
two.
the difference. Yeah.
Part two.
You don't necessarily have to have read the first one to read the second, because the second is about my police journey through special weapons or special operations. Yeah. So Victoria has a special operations group. I was in the Queensland equivalent for quite some years. I was involved in some pretty heavy stuff in that. Lost a colleague in a shootout. That was the beginning of my real PTSD issues, and I've written very openly and rawly about that as well. There's no secrets with me about many things that happened to me as a result of that. It is also about my then leaving that to go into criminal intelligence. I worked on motorcycle gangs for a couple of years. How I met my wife. Yeah, which is
that's it, because Jennifer's not in here. We don't get up to Jennifer.
No, that's right. That's a funny story in itself. I won't.
I was like, Jennifer, what happened to Kathleen?
Yeah, well, oops. So it's leading up to that time where I made the decision to leave. So I'm also, the Fitzgerald corruption inquiry happened during that time. So, I'm quite open about the impacts of that. I don't think it went far enough, but just how it changed the culture, etc. So hopefully it's as enjoyable and readable as the first one.
Well, I look forward to it.
Thank you. At least I've got one sale.
Yeah. So what does life look like for you now, post Queensland Police Force?
Yeah, look, I was recruited out into Coles Myer, into retail, as a national loss prevention investigator, risk manager, etc. I went to uni, did a master's of business, and then I just worked in the corporate field for a number of years. I'm now with a not-for-profit as a COO, a Chief Operations Officer. It's far cry from what I used to do, and that's what I do. I enjoy my job. That's all cool. I've got a lovely family, but I want to use as much opportunity as I can to continue the conversation about PTSD, not just for police, but for first responders. ADF veterans who've come back from Iraq and Afghanistan have major issues, but they get wonderful support. And there's nothing for first responders who leave. There's a lot while you're still employed by policing or the ambulance service or the fireys. Once you're gone, you're gone. And there's an epidemic of suicide that's just not being publicised, and it's not being acknowledged enough, in my view. So if I can use any opportunity that the book affords me to create an environment for people to start discussing this, maybe there's a ripple effect that will have a beneficial change ultimately. But yeah, that's my absolute passion, because it almost destroyed me. And now that I've come through the other side, hopefully, I really want to try and pay it forward.
Absolutely. And I think that's something readers would definitely take away from Drugs, Guns and Lies, is the need for that support right across all forces, really.
Yeah, and their partners and their families. The partners and families are the probably the unseen victims, because they either tolerate it and support people, or they leave them, so yeah.
Absolutely.
But it's not all doom and gloom. There's some funny stuff in there as well.
There is. And there are some times where I'm like, oh, that person almost killed you. Huh. If you had have done that instead of that, you'd be dead. Like, it's just,
very true.
Just sliding doors. Sliding doors. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Keith. I really appreciate it.
It's been a buzz. I really enjoy it, and thank you so much, and thank you to everybody who attended tonight. I really hope that that you do take the opportunity to have a read of it. If you borrow it from someone, that's okay too. Unlike other authors, I won't insist you buy it, but I just really like the message to get out there. It'd be great.
Well, you can borrow it now. Drugs, Guns and Lies is available on our RB Digital app. So if you are a member, if you're not, join up today and you've got immediate access. What am I up to? Also, you can purchase Drugs, Guns and Lies through Robertson's Bookshop. I have popped a link to that in the chat box right now if you wanted to click straight through. I highly recommend it. So Robertson's has that online right now and ready to dispatch in the next couple of days. Keep an eye on the Frankston City Library's website for the great Frank Talks we have coming up. And thank you so much for joining us for tonight's Frank Talk with Keith Banks for Frankston City Library.